Zeela's spindly clawed fingers curled around the cold metal relic. His lip twisted in disdain as he held it aloft, examining its crude form. This is one of theirs? The weapon's metal felt harsh, almost biting, as if it rejected his touch. Even dormant, it seemed charged with something he couldn't quite name. A murmur escaped his subordinate, Resko, who was observing the object with a mix of skepticism and discomfort. Zeela chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. If this is the best they can do, then humans must be simpler than I thought. Resko and his twin Norik exchanged an uncertain glance. Neither dared to challenge Zeela openly, though their silence betrayed unease. Zeela's eyes narrowed as he continued his examination, turning the weapon over in his hand. Tell me, are these humans truly as primitive as their tools? Norik gave a slight shrug, trying to hide his discomfort. Rumors say they can be, unpredictable, resourceful. But this? He gestured to the weapon, barely able to disguise his incredulity. It's laughable. They call it a rifle. A rifle, Zeela echoed, letting the word hang in the air as he weighed the weapon like a curious child, playing with a stick. He sneered, holding it up like some trivial artifact. It's solid, it's cold, and it throws chunks of metal. Is this not the extent of their creativity? He glanced at his men, and they shared a smirk. The Zithrax had traveled galaxies, dismantled advanced defenses, and fought war machines beyond comprehension. This relic, this rifle, was nothing more than a glorified slingshot in his eyes. With a condescending tilt of his head, he pressed further. Humanity, Earth's pitiful creatures, feared across the stars. For what? Their, sticks and stones. His mocking tone was edged with contempt as he tossed the rifle back to the floor with a loud clatter, dismissing it as mere debris. Commander, Resko ventured, sensing an opening. They say humans are tenacious, that their spirit is difficult to crush. Zeela smirked, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Tenacious, are they? And this? He kicked the weapon across the floor, watching it skitter to a halt. This is what they have to show for it? He spread his arms grandly, the arrogance of his kind on full display. But, well, I say we relieve them of their burden. These humans don't deserve the breath they draw, and certainly not the weapons they barely understand. With that, he turned and strode confidently toward the docking bay, signaling his crew to prepare for a swift descent onto Earth. Send a message to the Dominion. Humanity will fall within the cycle. Yet, as his words echoed through the chamber, neither Resko nor Norik could shake a growing sense of dread. The Dominion fleet arrived in Earth's orbit like a storm. Massive obsidian vessels blocked the sun, casting Earth's cities into shadow. Zeela watched from his command ship, eyes narrowed as his squadron prepared to deploy. His contempt for humanity hadn't faded. Instead, it festered, emboldened by the reports his scanners fed him. Earth's defenses were as primitive as he had expected. Low-energy shields, grounded communication relays, and only a handful of surface artillery units. Pathetic, he muttered, leaning forward to watch the live feed. On the screen, a few human soldiers scrambled across an open field, their rifles clutched tightly, desperation etched on their faces. They looked disorganized, panicked. Perfect. Commander Zeela, Resko interrupted, his voice tense. The Earth's atmosphere contains strange energy fluctuations. It's affecting our scanners. Perhaps we should... Enough with your worries, Resko. Zeela barked, his voice cold and final. These creatures are nothing but insects. Let them scurry. We will crush them, as we have countless others. Resko hesitated, casting a nervous glance at the view screen, but he nodded and stepped back, remaining silent. Zeela turned his attention back to the planet below, savoring the thrill of an inevitable conquest. With a swipe of his clawed hand, Zeela brought up a holographic display of Earth, zooming in on one of the human outposts scattered across the continent. It was there, on the outskirts of a small, abandoned town, that he saw a curious sight. A group of human soldiers, ragged but resolute, entrenched behind crude barricades. Zeela grinned, baring his sharp teeth. "They've managed to gather a few brave souls," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Very well. Let us test their resolve." He ordered a small detachment of Zithrax ground forces to descend to the surface, instructing them to move slowly, savoring the intimidation. The soldiers, equipped with shimmering energy shields and plasma rifles, would appear as gods to the humans below, unstoppable, invincible. As his troops touched down, Zeela watched, amused, as the human soldiers responded with their primitive rifles, firing round after round of solid metal projectiles. The bullets ricocheted harmlessly off the Zithrax armor, barely scratching the surface. It was a one-sided slaughter, exactly as Zeela had envisioned. But then something unexpected happened. One of the human soldiers, a young woman barely in her 20s, by Zeela's guess, stood firm amidst the chaos. She didn't flinch as her fellow soldiers fell around her, nor did she waver as she raised her weapon and took aim. Her eyes were cold, focused, and filled with a determination that Zeela had rarely seen, even among his own kind. What is she doing?" Norik murmured, leaning close to the view screen. Zeela's amusement faded, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. The young woman continued to fire, her shots growing more precise with each round. It was as if she was learning, adapting, finding the weak points in the Zithrax armor, and then, with a well-placed shot, she managed to strike one of the Zithrax soldiers in a vulnerable joint, piercing his armor and bringing him to his knees. Zeela's eyes widened, a spark of disbelief flashing across his face. "Impossible," he muttered. "How?" Resko turned to him, his face pale. "Commander, these humans, they're more resourceful than we anticipated. Perhaps we should reconsider our approach." But Zeela's pride burned hotter than his caution. He clenched his fists, his gaze locked onto the defiant figure of the human soldier on the screen. "No," he snarled. "They are insects, weak, primitive. They are no match for us." He slammed his fist onto the console, sending out a command for the Zithrax fleet to begin their full assault. "Deploy the plasma drones, the heavy artillery. I want this human encampment eradicated. Leave nothing behind." The sky above Earth darkened as wave after wave of Zithrax firepower rained down, incinerating everything in its path. Buildings crumbled, trees ignited, and the ground trembled under the relentless bombardment. But even as the smoke and ash filled the air, the humans continued to fight. Their ranks thinned, their defenses crumbled, yet they refused to retreat. Zeela watched in growing frustration as the humans held their ground, their defiance unwavering. His plan was supposed to be flawless, an effortless victory over an inferior species. And yet here they were, clawing, fighting, refusing to surrender. They're like animals," Norik whispered, awe and fear mingling in his voice. "They fight as if they have nothing to lose." "Enough!" Zeela roared, slamming his fist against the console. "Deploy the Devastator beam. We will crush these creatures once and for all." Resko's eyes widened in horror. "Commander, the Devastator beam. But it's forbidden to use it on planets with sentient life. The Council isn't here, Resko." Zeela snapped, his voice cold and venomous. "And they will never know. This is my victory, and I will not be denied by a handful of primitive apes." As he issued the command, a low hum resonated throughout the ship. The Devastator beam, a weapon of unimaginable power, began to charge, drawing energy from the ship's core. The humans below, sensing the imminent threat, scrambled to find cover, their faces etched with terror. But amidst the panic, Zeela's gaze fell once more on the young woman, the soldier, who had dared to stand her ground against him. Her expression remained defiant, her eyes fixed on the sky as if daring him to do his worst. For a fleeting moment, Zeela felt a strange pang of respect. No, he quickly dismissed the thought. They were nothing more than animals fighting out of instinct. And yet, as the beam's energy built to a crescendo, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake, underestimating something he didn't fully understand. "Fire," he commanded, his voice cold and resolute. The beam struck the earth with a blinding flash, carving through the atmosphere with raw, unstoppable energy. Zeela watched with grim satisfaction as the Devastator beam rained down, scorching the ground, incinerating everything in its path. He allowed himself a small, victorious smile, one that quickly faded as the dust began to settle. But as the smoke cleared, Zeela's eyes widened in disbelief. In the beam's wake, a faint glow remained on the surface, surrounded by patches of untouched ground. It was as if the energy had been absorbed, redirected somehow. He adjusted his view on the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The devastation was widespread, but in several pockets around the impact zone, human forces remained. "Battered but unbroken. Commander," Resko's voice was unsteady, a mixture of fear and confusion. They're still standing. How is that possible?" Zeela's rage flared. "It's impossible." He clenched his fists, his mind reeling. No species had withstood the Devastator beam. It was the ultimate weapon, a force of obliteration, and yet here were these humans, defying all logic, still ready for battle, still unwilling to yield. As he watched, the humans regrouped, rallying around the remnants of their barricades. The young woman, the one who had defied him from the start, was among them. Despite the dirt and blood that covered her, her gaze remained unwavering, her stance unbroken. She raised her weapon and pointed it toward the sky, as if aiming directly at him, challenging him. Norok stammered, "Commander, we don't have another beam charge available. The cooldown will take hours. Perhaps we should retreat, regroup." "Retreat?" Zeela spat, his pride overriding all reason. "Against these creatures? Never!" He activated the comms, addressing all remaining Zithrax forces on the ground. "All units advance, crush them underfoot. Use everything at your disposal. Leave no one alive." The Zithrax forces moved forward, a wall of dark metal and advanced weaponry marching across the charred landscape. Plasma rounds lit up the battlefield, vaporizing anything they touched. Yet, as the Zithrax soldiers advanced, the humans met them with an intensity that defied reason. Zeela watched, his confidence giving way to a creeping sense of dread. The humans fought back with relentless determination, their makeshift weapons and crude tactics holding their ground against the Zithrax onslaught. Their lines faltered, broke, and reformed like a wave against the shore, undeterred by the overwhelming power facing them. And then, amidst the chaos, Zeela saw something that sent a chill down his spine, a flash of light high above Earth's atmosphere, faint but unmistakable. "Commander," Resko whispered, his voice barely audible, "there are more ships, human ships." Zeela's gaze snapped to the screen, his heart pounding as a fleet of human vessels emerged from behind the moon, advancing steadily toward his fleet. They were smaller, less advanced, each barely a fraction of the size of his command ship, but their numbers were staggering, and they were moving with a purpose that spoke of calculated intent. "No," Zeela muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "They can't be. They're supposed to be scattered, unprepared." The human ships opened fire, their missiles streaking across the void, colliding with the Zithrax fleet in a cacophony of explosions. The humans were using tactics he'd never seen before, leveraging the terrain, moving in unpredictable patterns, striking with precision. It was as if they had been waiting, planning for this exact moment. As the first Zithrax vessels began to fall, Zeela's panic turned to desperation. He barked orders, trying to regain control, but his commands were met with chaos and confusion. His once mighty fleet was breaking apart, scattered by the relentless assault. On the ground, the humans seized the advantage, pushing forward with renewed vigor. The young woman Zeela had seen earlier was at the front, rallying her comrades, leading them forward with an unyielding spirit. She moved like a force of nature, her resolve infecting those around her, driving them to press on. Zeela felt his pride crumbling, replaced by a deep, primal fear. He had underestimated them. Not just their weapons, but their resilience, their refusal to yield, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "Commander, we must retreat," Resco pleaded, his voice frantic. "The humans, they're what?" Zeela hissed, though the defiance had drained from his voice. "They're just humans." But he knew deep down that he had been wrong. These humans were more than he'd given them credit for. They weren't just primitive creatures, they were relentless, driven by something far beyond survival. With one last look at the battlefield, Zeela activated the ship's evacuation protocol. Alarms blared, echoing through the corridors as his remaining forces scrambled for the escape pods. It was a humiliating end to what he had thought would be a swift victory. A reminder that even the most advanced technology was no match for sheer, unbreakable will. As he boarded his escape pod, Zeela glanced back at the view screen one last time. The humans were still advancing, their numbers growing as more survivors emerged from the wreckage. The young woman, now leading a charge directly toward the remains of his flagship, locked eyes with him through the screen, her gaze fierce and unyielding. Zeela shuddered, finally understanding the truth. Humanity's strength wasn't in their weapons or their technology. It was in their refusal to submit, their ability to face death without flinching. As his escape pod launched into the void, carrying him away from the battle he'd so arrogantly started, Zeela's final thought was one of bitter regret. He would return to the Dominion defeated, his legacy tarnished by a species he had once considered insignificant. And on the planet below, as the last Zithrax forces crumbled, humanity stood victorious, not because of their weapons, but because of their unyielding spirit.
Enjoyed that? Tap subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Trust me, you won't want to.